Good morning and welcome to our third session this morning, which will be about IMTA production. So it's dealing more with the project outcomes from impact. And I'm Kati Michalek. I'm based at SAMS, that's the Scottish Association for Marine Science in Scotland. And there I'm working on seaweed cultivation, but also on the co-cultivation potential with shellfish. This morning you heard already quite a bit about IMTA during Frank's introductory talk for impact. And just to give you an overview, the status in Europe at the moment is as follows. So predominantly we do have small trials, but they are usually experimental trials or some small scale commercial trials. And all of these, no matter if they are research or commercial, are highly driven by national or European research initiatives. And here I listed just some projects which might be of interest to you if you are interested in IMTA production. I could highly recommend to do some research and go back and read up on the outputs from projects like iDream or Integrate and many more. For all of these trials, they're usually making use of existing aquaculture sites, so finfish sites, where extractive species are added to the system. And that could be either seaweeds or shellfish or both. However, we are currently at the moment still not fully exploiting the potential Europe has for IMTA production, and that has many reasons. One of them being also something we heard this morning, that there is a paucity in data and in the transfer of knowledge and technology, but there are also issues which are more relating towards how do you get a license to produce IMTA? How do you harvest or process some of these crops, and actually also issues with marketing and selling, especially for seeds. So this is something Frank showed you earlier this morning. So in Impact, we employed 6 pilot sites, and all of these pilot sites were actually monoculture sites to start with, and were transitioned to IMTA sites throughout the project. We employed all 3 production systems. So we have inland, coastal, and offshore production. We have research sites, which are fully experimental and also commercial sites. And all of these sites are either employing 2 trophic levels, which would be low trophic aquaculture. So we're looking at shellfish and seaweed together, or 3 trophic levels, which is more the classic IMTA approach where you have finfish, shellfish, and seaweed. And I'm not going to have time to run you through all of them, but just to highlight Chambly, for example, they are based in Turkey and they are a commercial sea bass producer and now introduced mussel cultivation and seaweed cultivation in their system. And we also, for example, have North Sea farms. They are based offshore from the Dutch coastline, and they are trialing modules of seaweed and mussel cultivation in the rough Dutch waters. So again, something that has been picked up this morning already and is one of our key focus areas in impact is data. And data in itself doesn't tell you much if you don't use it right. So data becomes knowledge is a key phrase. And it's also termed sometimes precision aquaculture. And I'm just going to mention it now before I forget. So if you are interested more in this topic, then I would like to invite you to please join at our 3rd webinar, which is happening 2 weeks from now on precision aquaculture. So in Impact, we employed a whole system monitoring approach, which is hugely important. So it's not enough to just monitor the environment and see what goes in, what goes out. But obviously, as an investor, as an operator, but also as a regulator, you have an interest on how does the stock react and what does your infrastructure actually do. So we conducted real-time monitoring at all of our pilot sites, so moving away from very time-consuming and also costly manual sampling to autonomous sampling. And all this data is directly fed into a management system where we can follow live in real time what our infrastructure is doing. We get warnings, we get live messages, etc. But most importantly, we can answer production questions. So by feeding data constantly into this management system and training it over multiple production cycles, you get predictions as to when, for example, is the best time to harvest your crop, which again, obviously is not only hugely important for the producer because he saves money and is making most efficient use of his space and of his crop, but it's also important for potential new investors into IMTA systems and also regulatory bodies. And also we had developed an IMTA model, which again, same as the integrated management system, can be used for operators and regulators alike. And if you want to know more, just join the webinar 2 weeks from now. Another key aspect in impact was the focus on circularity, sustainability, and social economy. So we had an entire work package dedicated to these topics. And overall, for all the 6 pilots, what we found is that IMTA comes with an environmental and social economic benefit. So throughout all the pilot sites, we did see a reduction in environmental impact, and that's mostly related to reduction in eutrophication by the seaweeds and the shellfish, most importantly, taking up nutrients from the water. But also we could enhance the cost effectiveness of the site. So just a basic example, instead of going to the site multiple times, you only have to go once, but now you have more species growing at the same time. So that reduces your investment in stuff, but also labor costs, etc., and all these things. We found added ecosystem services. So not only taking nitrogen and phosphor out of the water, for example, but also providing nursery grounds for other marine species living in the same ecosystem. And we saw that there is an enhancement in the site's productivity. So you can use your space you already have. If you're one of them who's converting an existing aquaculture site, you can basically make use of your already existing space by adding additional species, which not only gives you potential new income, but also helps your environment. And also you make better use of the seasonality of these crops. So seaweed, for example, has a 9 months cultivation cycle, and for the remaining 3 months, the cycle will be bare, whilst if you add shellfish, the site is used again for another product. And here we will also have another aquaculture related series next week on circularity in aquaculture. So again, impact will be represented there and you can hear more. There are 3 issues, policy issues related to IMTA production. One of them is the system configuration, and the other two I'm going to touch on in a second. But for even designing your IMTA system, there is not one formula, it's a concept, as Thierry Chopin highlighted many times throughout his research. And it starts with basic things like the design of your site. So where are you situated? The location is important. So if you're an offshore cultivation site, obviously you have to think about storm damage. You have to think about passageways for other ships, etc. Then there are environmental constraints. So you have to take into account the hydrodynamics of your system and the proximity to any discharge areas, and let it even be river discharge. And also the scale and configuration of your site. It's also important that one keeps in mind which species do you want to grow, and there it shouldn't be only a commercial interest in terms of what brings me the most money in the shortest amount of time at the least cost. It also should very importantly be considered that the species you are intending to grow is endemic to that area, so you don't introduce foreign species to that site. Also, obviously, a lot of competences and skills are required. So if you are a monoculture farmer, let's say, you have your skill set, but if you extend that and you include different species and other trophic levels, you have to amp up your knowledge and your competences and have to learn about husbandry and welfare of these species and their cultivation and processing. And there's also the need for that you have an available market and access to that market. And you have to not only take consumers' interests and demands there in terms of where your seafood comes from, but you also have to have access to these processing facilities. And for seaweed, that's sometimes, still not completely developed in all of the locations seaweed is grown. Licensing has been flagged many times before, not only by Impact as one of the key hurdles for IMTA development in Europe. And also for us, I'm just listing some here as an example, but it actually spans through many of our pilots. Main issues are that there is no IMTA license at the moment, which is understandable because it's hard to implement. So what you have at the moment is you apply for a license to either grow finfish, shellfish, and so on. And each of these license applications come with a set of requirements. So you are looking at being asked to perform an environmental impact assessment, have a public consultation, and all these things. And for us, that meant we started off as a seaweed cultivation site for experimental purposes only. And we asked for an amendment to our existing license to add a small amount of native oysters to trial the IMTA system. And it took us 9 to 10 months to get there. So just saying, if you're an investor or potential investor, you are looking at a very, very time-consuming application process, a complex process, and there should be simply a one-stop shop where people get more information and more streamlined information. Standardization and certification here brings an opportunity. So in Impact, we employed or we actively supported the development of standards for seaweed. So I put that here at the bottom. Our Impact partner, North Sea Farmers, they're working with the European Committee for Standardization, but also with the Dutch representatives on algae food product-based standards, but also together with Global GAP to work on a certification scheme for seaweed farming. We also contributed to a EU survey, which was recently posted on a code of practice for researchers on standardization. And the benefit here is both standards and certificates, they give you a technical benchmark or technical documents on the do's and don'ts, which is not only interesting for consumers and regulators, but most importantly for potential investors and operators. What do I have to do? Who do I have to contact, etc.? Which boxes do I have to tick? And how can we come up with a standard operating procedure for things like seaweed, for example? And just to sum up, for us towards an IMTA success, what we see is share, simplify, and exploit. So sharing is the knowledge gained from research, and in Impact, we have done loads, we have done environmental impact assessments, IMTA models, socioeconomics, and have done all that homework. And if you're interested, you will find our outputs either on our project webpage or on the Cordis portal from the European Union. There should be a community of practice, so one-stop shop for IMTA investors and regulatory bodies where you find information either about how are species grown, but also regarding licensing, etc. The whole licensing application should be simplified and harmonized, at least within countries. So again, one-stop shops nationwide and ideally, obviously European-wide, but we understand that's difficult to implement. And we should employ standardization and certification tools more. And overall, it should be a joint endeavor between science and industry and not a separate one. And we simply have to start talking to each other more than we already do. And here's just a hint, and I would leave with that. So we are working on policy briefs at the moment as one of our project outcomes from Impact. And one of them will be about the development of IMTA in the EU and its potential. And the second one about seaweed standardization. And they're in production at the moment, so they should be out soon. And you can follow the status either on the webpage or also on our social media channels like Twitter. And yeah, now we can go into our panel discussion. As Dave already mentioned at the start of the session, we have Paul Tett here. Paul is at SAMS for most of his career, and he's currently involved in two Horizon 2020 projects, Aquavitae and Blue Growth Farms, looking at social science and policy. And afterwards, we have Damien Toner, who will talk about the need for monitoring and data for policy development. Ian Payne, unfortunately, couldn't make it with us today, so we have our two panelists. Thank you.
Okay, am I going first, Kathy?
I think you are.
Okay, thank you. So good morning. I'm going to use my 3 minutes to speak about sociological findings in relation to the multi-use of sea space. So my project, the Blue Growth Farm, is interested in combining fish farming with offshore wind and wave energy. However, I think our findings are relevant to all forms of inshore multi-use, including multi-species aquaculture. So neither wind turbines nor fish pens are new in principle, but their offshore deployment is part of a profound change in the use of coastal seas. This is a new industrial revolution that's intruding into the mechanized hunter-gathering that is modern commercial fisheries. Society has both to consent to and to manage these new activities. Top-down management involves government, environmental and planning laws implemented through zoning and development licensing. Societal consent starts from the bottom with communities' attitudes to development. If these attitudes are negative, non-governmental organizations can help antipathy to ascend to governance levels and frustrate development through court cases or through lobbying for new legal restrictions. And people's purchasing decisions aggregated through markets can also determine the viability of a development. The sociological research group at SAMS that I represent is part of the Horizon 2020 Blue Grove Farm project, which is designing a large floating offshore structure combining a fish farm with electricity generation from wind and wave. We found that official permitting processes for such structures are complicated because the two kinds of activity are differently regulated in many parts of Europe. And I guess this is a common finding. We also investigated community opinions about fish farming and renewable energy in Italy and Scotland in order to understand how developers might best gain community support, what we call social license to operate. We found that opinions about offshore renewable energy were more positive than opinions about fish farming. We found that local developments were more likely to encounter objections unless communities were well engaged and hopeful about socio-economic benefits. And I don't just mean payoffs, I mean things like skilled jobs for the next generation. And finally, we found that distrust of public environmental regulation was widespread. And so my take-home message from all this is that it's important for researchers and developers to try to gain social license for new forms of sea use, and this may not be simple. So thank you, that's my 2 pennyworth.
Thanks, Paul. So as Kathy said, my name is Damien Toner. I work for BIM in Ireland. And recently I've been working on the OASIS project, which is trying to utilize duckweed and algae to take up nutrients produced in a fish system and then to use the duckweed as an alternative protein. And I guess my experience with that system kind of informs some of the points I'm about to make. So picking up on Kathy's theme, particularly around policy in relation to IMTA, I think we are probably broadly all in agreement that the future of aquaculture will need to have a more holistic approach and certainly a circular economy approach. However, to do that correctly, we need to inform policymakers and farmers of the benefits of that, and certainly to prove to policymakers that the circularity is being achieved. And in that regard, I think there are 2 areas that we need to put much more resources into. And the first is in relation to sensors. In other food production environments, be it in processing facilities or even in terrestrial farms, we're dealing with a very different environment. And it's quite often possible to get very good empirical data out of production systems. That's not generally the case, certainly in the marine environment, freshwater environments, where you have very complex interactions happening and you're not in control of all of those interactions. Probably the most controlled environment we have in aquaculture is in research systems. And even there, we don't fully understand what's happening entirely between water chemistry, between the bacteria in the system, between the fish, etc. And then when we transfer that to an IMTA system, we can imagine the thousands of variables that are happening. So we need to really see the development of efficient real-time sensor technology. And that will allow us to gather the information which we can then show to farmers and to the wider public and to policymakers. And I think that technology is then going to have to interlink with the other users in that environment as well. So shipping, tourism, terrestrial runoff, all of these other inputs into that marine environment have to be taken into consideration. And what we've seen so far with sensors is that they're not robust enough for the marine environment. We have issues with fouling, etc. They might have to be calibrated too often. They've generally been developed in a lab environment and don't translate very easy to the environments that fish farms work in. So that's an area that's going to require significant resources. And the second point leading on from that is data collection and data mining. We generate enormous amounts of data in aquaculture, but I don't think we really utilize it very well. And we're going to have to see systems in future which mine that data and give accurate information again to policymakers and to farmers to allow them to manage those systems more effectively. And I think that's a significant challenge for IMTA systems in particular, where you've lots of complex interactions happening between different species. So I think in future, we're going to have to see projects and programs really focus more on those two specific areas and try and make large scale improvements if we're going to try and achieve what we want to achieve. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Damien. Yes, both you and Paul had some really interesting insights there. Now we're going to come back to the panel. I encourage everyone, if they've got questions for them, to start posting on the Q&A. But just now we're going to do another polling that's coming up now. And you need to go to www.menti.com on your device. Just put that code in. It's a different code to the last time. And then give us your responses. Are you optimistic that IMTA can become a core part of European aquaculture? So let's see how this polls out as we get your votes in. Wow, coming up fast. Bit of a balance going on there. Majority saying yes. A lot of optimists in the room. Good, good, good. Okay. And then the second one, you're on the same code. Which do you think is the greatest benefit of IMTA? So we've got the lead on the environmental remediation. Okay. Strongly in the ascendance. Enhancing consumer perception of aquaculture is coming up. Optimizing use of space. Very good. So you can continue to add your votes if it's taking a while to get online and do this, but we're certainly getting a clear steer on this, that for policymakers, being able to evidence environmental remediation, really what Damien just said, how can that data about environmental remediation actually having an impact be measured? How can we get more robust sensors? How can that really work? And in one word, please describe the key barriers for IMTA development in Europe. Easy knowledge, perception, licensing markets. Should we, for example, be trying to attain higher market values for products that are produced in IMTA because they are more harmonized with respect to the environment and have some environmental remediation function? What do you consider the main benefit of standardization schemes for either seaweed farming or seaweed-based products? So helping on consumer information, yeah, SOPs, let's get procedures that we can share, this idea of a collective approach, communities of practice, as Cathy mentioned in her presentation. Should IMTA and IMTA related systems be managed on a site scale or a water body, i.e. ecosystem scale? So this idea of shared space being really important and being acknowledged by the audience here. Really, one of the issues that certification bodies are struggling with, standard setters, how can we look at impacts just at the enterprise scale when enterprises are often clustered and have different types of impacts? That's interesting. Now the consumer, is it worth more? Yes, no, no, yes, yes, no, no, yes. Jury's out on this one, guys. Maybe we got to tell that story better and keep ourselves in the news and the media explaining what we're doing. But let's perhaps go to some of the questions that have come up. And I've got one here that I'm not sure who's best placed to answer, but this issue of bioaccumulation of undesirable substances that occur through trophic levels. It seems to be a concern of IMTA. Has that been part of the impact study. Is there a data set being established that can be available to policymakers to set their, to be able to evidence the fact that these are benign systems? Kathy, could you talk to that?
Yeah, so there are various things that happened in Impact, to be honest. One of them was more a focus on your product in the end. So we are partnering with the Agricultural University in Athens, and throughout Impact, whatever we produced, our former species, but also our new components, we sent off to them for microbial testing. So it was more looking at the microbiome associated with these products and how they compare mono or baseline versus now implemented IMTA system. And there we found some interesting findings. I can't recall them now all from the top of my head, but again, you will hear more in next week's webinar. And also in the precision aquaculture webinar, if I'm not mistaken. Otherwise, we are working on finalizing public reports from Impact, and they are all available soon. So the project will come to an end by the end of August, but all our deliverable reports are public. And I would advise that you watch out for any reports that come out of Work Package 5 as well, which is circularity, sustainability. So their life cycle assessments have been performed, environmental impact assessments. And I remember that we looked at nutrient budgets also, so how much nitrogen and phosphorus actually going into the system, coming out in the respective pilots. For some pilots, this was easier to do than for others. And as we are all aware, especially when you're talking open system that we do have in coastal aquaculture sites, but also on offshore sites, obviously, then it's much harder to make a quantitative estimate of what came in and what went out and where did it go.
Good. Thank you, Kathy.
Not sure if that
Paul,
answers the question though.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
No, I hope that somewhat answered the question.
Okay, thank you. Paul, you talk about the social acceptability, gaining that, so important social license to operate aquaculture in these marine spaces. I wonder what you see, if anything, is the role of citizen science in making the case, really, through how it's been used in terrestrial systems, the monitoring of local environments, and how that can buy into social license. I don't know if you have any experience, or that's something that Impact's been trying out as part of your activities.
Good question, Dave. I haven't any direct experience of that in the projects I've been involved in, but some of my colleagues in SANS are involved in citizen science. And I think my view would be that it can be part of the engagement process. And engagement requires trying to get communities positively involved in various activities relating to the development. So I think that citizen science, possibly through monitoring environmental impacts, can help with engagement, and particularly as we have found there's distrust in the ability of the public environmental regulators to do their work. So I think potentially citizen science can be positive. However, there is a caution here that quite often what people deduce from the citizen science depends on what sort of worldview they bring to what they're doing. If they come with a prejudice against particular sorts of fish farming, then their own observations may confirm their initial views. So I think this is something that has to be handled as part of an engagement process, and not just as a good thing in itself.
Okay, good. I mean, the thing that strikes in my mind is that it's a really very different approach to improving sensors and the big data approach that's funneled into the policymaking environment. It's perhaps a more bottoms-up approach, and maybe we need both. Well, what would your view on that be, Damien? Because you talk to the need for better quality and control and availability of big data, but do you see this has a?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that we should look at IMTA just in its own right in terms of aquaculture. I think we have to look at the wider marine spatial planning system. And, you know, I'm not convinced that the consumer, for example, would specifically need to know about IMTA in a way. You know, what a consumer wants to know is that the produce that they're buying is sustainable and that it comes from a sustainable source. And I think what they would like to see is that the environment that that's been grown in is managed well from a policy point of view. So that then takes into account agriculture runoff, tourism, shipping, all the other activities that happen within that environment. And I don't think we should run down the rabbit hole of just focusing on the aquaculture component and say, right, let's get our bit in order, because there's so many other influences that which would affect that. So if you have a seaweed farm and a salmon farm, there's lots of variables within what they're doing, but also related to those other activities that are happening. So I would like to see IMTA practice become obviously better managed and licensed in some way, and obviously from a public perception point of view promoted. I don't think we can separate it out from those other activities. And I don't think the policymakers would want us to either.
No.
We have to look at it as a kind of holistic, because that's what the circular economy is. You know, those nutrients that bivalves are taking up are coming from the land or from other marine sources. So you can't separate them out. So I think it's important that in any of these projects, we keep that in mind as well, you know.
Yeah. That's great. In fact, there's a question about and it's come up about there are some uncontrollable, non-controllable parameters such as water temperature. What's the view how that's, especially in this era of climate change, might be expected to, you know, affect different parts of the IMTA in different ways? Kathy, or anyone really to perhaps answer that.
I can make a start, but maybe Damien can chip in, or Paul. That's not an easy one. So with all these key environmental parameters, and you have a certain set of key parameters in your production system, and for many species, their overarching temperature would be one of them. So it affects fish, but also shellfish and seaweed. And the only solution to that problem would be monitoring, to be honest. But there we are coming back to also things that have been picked up on this morning. Who's paying for this monitoring? It's very costly at the moment, and coming up with low-cost solutions is in development and is in the making, and that's where we are going. But there's still an element of cost involved. And as Damien mentioned earlier, more importantly than that, an element of personnel to actually mine that data also, and not just collect it for the sake of collecting. And then you are looking at environmental impact models also. So you need a set of data, you need predictive model capabilities and knowledge. So you have to have trained personnel, and then you can make predictions of the sensibility of your system to environmental stressors like increases in temperature or reductions in pH, etc., etc.
Yes, and I guess that comes back to one of the points you made about, you know, one of the challenges is that the more complex, the more species, the more the capacities are required by staff running such IMTA enterprises rather than single species enterprises. There's a follow-on question really. What are the biggest challenges for a farmer who's currently a monoculture operation, a salmon farmer on his own or a mussel farmer, actually moving to IMTA? What's the impact experience in that area?
Yeah, I can chip in on that. It again depends on your starting point. So if you are starting off as a seaweed farm, you will have different experiences than if you would have started off as a finfish site. So let's use these examples. If you are an existing shellfish or finfish site and you want to add seaweed, I got the impression there will be less hurdles in your way, because overall the knowledge is there that seaweed is extracting inorganic nutrients from the water. If we have fed aquaculture like finfish, they're excreting nutrients. There are also problems with uneaten food pellets, etc. So that's generally considered a good thing. And I feel there are less hurdles still existing. However, the other way around, if you're starting off as a seaweed farm, for example, and you make your case that you would like to use your existing infrastructure to grow mussels or oysters, etc., suddenly you're looking at more questions asked in terms of, hang on, what would be the environmental impact of adding now shellfish to that system? We need an environmental impact assessment from you, and etc., etc. The list goes on. So the more, I don't know the English word there, but the more fragile the species you grow. So shellfish, for example, is an example, because there we're looking at toxic algae bloom monitoring, because the last thing you want is have any shellfish toxins produced in your oysters or your mussels, etc., and then sell that onto the market. For seaweed, you have to monitor heavy metal accumulation. Again, you don't want to pass on a product that maybe exceeds thresholds for metals or arsenic or even iodine levels, etc., etc. So there's a balance between the things you have to do from a licensing perspective, but also the interests of a fish health inspectorate and from a seafood quality and safety point of view. They're coming together.
Okay. I've got a final question here, and that is, around the methodologies that you're interested in impacts, you're interested in building social license. So what sort of tools that combine environmental and social environmental impact assessments is Impact using? And would you consider more sort of explicit ecosystem accounting tools that can look at several different trophic levels?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we didn't do much from a social aspect, which is a bit of a shame, because it would have been nice to get the societal aspect and impact as well. So we focused more on the environment and on the economy, to be honest. And I mean, we did loads. And again, if you want to know more details from the people who did the work, then join the webinar on circularity next week. But I remember that for the life cycle assessment and for the eco-efficiency assessment, we used ISO standards. So there are ISO accredited standard forms and standard procedures you have to follow. For ecosystem service assessment, Deltaris has worked on that, our Dutch partner, and they use different approaches, from Bayesian modeling to a yield-based quantitative calculation. Yeah, and I could go on. I also know there was an ABRA model used for the cost effectiveness, but I'm not familiar with the details, so it would be not my point to go on in too much detail here, I think, before I say something wrong.
That's great. I mean, there's some more questions that are popping up in the Q&A, and the panelists are typing their answers, so watch out for that. We've run out of time in this session, so I'd like to thank all of the panelists, Kati for leading this one,